Hi, I'm Lindsay Moreau. I'm a naturopathic doctor and clinical consultant for US Biotech. Today, we're going to be talking about the organic acid and how to use the test to understand what's a really good diet for your patient. And we're going to be using diabetes or prediabetes as our case example, because I think this is an area that the test really shines and can help you make clinical decisions quickly and effectively for your patient. So we've got three different patients that we're going to be looking at. Two of them are pre-diabetic. One was like full-on diabetic, an A1C of about 13. And so all of these patients, we use the test to help understand, well, how do we get that A1C down to a reasonable level? What's the best diet for you? So one of the issues with diabetes is that there's many different recommended diets out there. Some people just limit carbs, some eliminate them completely, and then there's some people who use a low-fat vegan diet and they get great results too. And the trick is that not every diet works for every patient, but you do want to pick the best diet for patient as effectively as possible, because the faster you can get that A1C down to normal, the less damage they're going to have overall from that elevated blood sugar. So let's take a look at our three different tests. So we're going to start by looking at all the different markers that can go high when you have an issue with your blood sugar. And there's a lot on the test. Not all of them need to be out of range for it to be an obvious, yes, there's an issue there. We're just looking for an overall pattern. So we're going to look at the first test. And on this one, we can see that there's a couple different markers that are out of range for her. And one of the big ones is the alpha-ketoglutarate and succinate discrepancy. This is blood sugar marker number one. This patient only had pre-diabetes. She was pretty low, like right around a 5.7, 5.8. But she's also a chiropractor and had already done a lot of really good things with her health and was very aware of the changes she needed to do. And her A1C wasn't changing. So we ran this test, and right away I can see that, okay, that high succinate and low alpha-ketoglutarate could be like an indication for her blood sugar issues. And unlocking that pathway in her citric acid cycle could also help normalize her blood sugar as well. So that was marker number one. Another one that we can sometimes see is subarate being high in isolation. So her test has that one perfectly, and that's a common one. But we might also see in the fatty acid oxidation section is that methylsuccinate can also be high. Hers was not. The reason that methylsuccinate goes high with insulin dysregulation is that methylsuccinate is taken by the pancreas, and it helps stimulate insulin release. And so if your body is really trying to crank out that insulin, methylsuccinate could be higher. So that's another sign that we look out for here. Another marker that we might see are protein metabolism markers all being elevated. So we know that with diabetes, there's often an increase in circulating BCAAs. And because all of these protein metabolism markers are breakdown from your branched chain amino acids, it stands to reason that they might also be really high. This patient didn't have an issue with proteins at all, so she was able to process those well. The next section that we can find blood sugar markers on is your ketone metabolites. So your ketone metabolites, especially alpha hydroxybutyrate, might be elevated a bar above beta hydroxybutyrate, indicating an insulin dysregulation. That's the biggest thing that drives alpha hydroxybutyrate up. You might also see alpha hydroxybutyrate and beta hydroxybutyrate going high together if that patient happens to have really poor blood sugar control and they are tipping more into ketosis. That can also be an indicator there. The last marker that's kind of a weak marker for blood sugar, but that you can more associate with as a downstream effect of having poorly regulated insulin would be pyroglutamate. So pyroglutamate is on the pathway making glutathione, and unsurprisingly, you might find pyroglutamate low with blood sugar dysregulation. That can be a side effect. So that's another marker to check as well. So that's a really good thing to do if you are worried about a patient's blood sugar marker as you're going through one of these tests, just looking to see, hey, how many of those blood sugar markers did they tick off? So when we looked at this first patient here, we saw that she's got two major markers. Her alpha hydroxybutyrate is in the normal range, so we're not as worried about that. Maybe a smidge high for somebody who's not doing any fasting. So 2 to 3 markers for her, and that's enough to be able to say, okay, yep, that's an issue. Now, when we compare that to another test, we're gonna look at this one over here. So this patient, when we look through, we can see a couple different markers for her that were out of range. The big one for her were her fatty acid markers were really high. Oddly enough, subarate was fine, but we can see that she's not processing those well. And then when we drop down to protein metabolism markers, she's really not processing those well at all. They're almost all high. So when we see a picture like this, even though she was pre-diabetic, with this patient, we didn't want to keep pushing fats and proteins. That's what she had been doing. She was trying to eat a healthy diet, paleo-style diet, trying to regulate that, and her body wasn't processing it well. So unfortunately, this patient had picked the wrong diet for herself, And so when we see that picture of, okay, we've got these high fatty acids and these high protein markers, that's enough to really start pushing us towards having a blood sugar issue. And then the nail in her coffin were ketone metabolites were both quite high. So her body was not doing well on her diet that she was using for blood sugar regulation with, some intermittent fasting and a paleo style diet again. So higher fat, higher protein. And then we have our third patient. So this patient was the full-on diabetic. He was on medications already when he came to me to help start lowering that A1C from, I think it was a 13. And he has really interesting markers different from the other two. So we can see when we look at him, his pyruvate and lactate are quite high. So we know that his body has a lot of sugars coming in, but then when we look at his fatty acids and his proteins, they're not as high as his sugar intake. And so for this patient, we were able to focus in on eating more fats for that blood sugar as opposed and removing carbs, which is the exact opposite. If you look back at the patient we just looked at, or with her, we really needed to cut back on her carb intake or her fat intake and her protein intake, and we really wanted to push her towards more of a Mediterranean style diet with a lot more healthy carbs, more that low-fat vegan style diet, which the reason that works for, or what I knew that would work for her for lowering her blood sugar is that we could see that the branched chains was a big driving factor for her blood sugar dysregulation. So switching to a low protein diet or low animal protein diet allows those markers to normalize, which helps reset that cellular metabolism. And so that can be a really effective strategy to employ with your patients is, okay, run the organic acid, your A1Cs, pre-diabetic, maybe early diabetic, doesn't really matter. Look for the markers that are most out of range and then use their diet to address the things that you see that are out of range. And that can really help guide you pick the right diet for your patients. So we've got 3 different patient examples today. And they all ended up on 3 different diets. So our first patient who we saw with the high subarate and the moderate protein and the big split between her carbohydrates, she had been pushing towards more of a higher fat diet. So what we ended up doing with her was focusing on healthy carbohydrates, lots of fiber, and we added in more protein. And she noticed that the protein really did make a difference for her. And so that was an effective strategy, as well as working on some of her pathway blocks, like the one between succinate and fumarate was a big one for her. The second patient, who was also pre-diabetic, we put her on the low-fat vegan diet because you can see, again, her protein markers were very high, her fats were very high, so that was my official recommendation. She was not happy about it, just for reference, but we had the testing to show her, hey, look, this is going to be a good fit for you. So that was really encouraging for her to have that data and gave her the confidence to be able to execute that diet. And then our last patient, the full-on diabetic with the very high pyruvate, the moderate fatty acids, and the fairly high proteins. It's always harder the more diabetic somebody is to know where to go with their diet. So with this patient, we opted to really focus in on increasing his fats because that was the marker that he seemed to do the best with. And then we also focus on mobilizing his proteins because you can see on his succinate was low, so his proteins were not feeding into that very well. And so we were able to help intervene there to get the protein markers moving so he could stay on a high fat, high protein diet and effectively use that fuel. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better idea of how to use the organic acid test to figure out diets for your patients. If you have any questions, be sure to reach out.